I came home after 3 weeks away at an agricultural conference and found my wife silent, trembling, and nearly 12 pounds thinner. The moment I reached my farm, I knew something was wrong. The gate lock had been changed, the family sign was gone, and my wife whispered, "Is she still here?" I checked the garage camera I never told anyone about, and my heart stopped. I saw someone entering my home every day, changing the locks, turning neighbors away, and hiding documents that could take away the farm my family had built for generations. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something inside, you drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. It means everything to know you're out there. Welcome to Revenge Dad. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is one worth keeping. The last 400 miles always felt the longest. I had a thermos of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder, a country radio station cutting in and out through the Wyoming flatlands, and a picture in my head I'd been carrying since the moment I loaded my truck in Denver 3 weeks ago. Eleanor in her garden. Late August light coming gold through the cottonwood trees. Her in that old straw hat she'd had since before our son would have been born, if we'd had one. The brim frayed on the left side, where she'd caught it on the tractor fence post back in the summer of 2011, and she'd never once considered replacing it. That was the picture I drove toward, 400 miles of it. I am Walter Hayes. I am 62 years old, and I have farmed the same 120 acres outside Cooperstown, New York, for 38 years. My father built the barn in 1969. He transferred the deed to me in 1987 with a handshake and a single sentence: "This land fed 3 generations. Don't be the one who loses it." I have thought about those words every planting season since. The farm runs corn on the east fields, tomatoes and squash in the kitchen garden. Eleanor tends herself a small apple orchard on the north slope that produces enough each fall for cider and enough left over to sell at the Cooperstown Farmers Market on Saturday mornings. We keep 12 head of dairy cattle and a chicken coop that Eleanor refuses to let me modernize. She says the old wood keeps them calmer. I stopped arguing about it sometime around our 20th anniversary. 3 weeks ago, I left for the National Agricultural Development Conference in Denver, Colorado. It was the first time in 38 years I had left Eleanor alone on the farm for more than a long weekend. She had insisted I go. The conference covered new drought-resistant corn varieties and updated irrigation techniques, things that mattered to a farm like ours, where a bad summer could mean the difference between comfort and a conversation with the bank. Eleanor had stood on the porch steps when I pulled out, waving with her garden glove still on her right hand, smiling the way she does when she's pretending something doesn't bother her. I should have read that smile better. I had called her every evening for the first week. The calls were short, but warm. She said the tomatoes were coming in heavy, that Ruth Hennings from next door had stopped by, with a pie that Victoria was settling in nicely, and had already helped reorganize the mudroom. Our daughter Victoria had come home from Los Angeles 2 weeks before I left, saying she wanted a change, wanted to be closer to family, wanted to help us with the farm. I had been glad. Eleanor had been glad. Victoria at 36 was sharp and capable, and the idea of having her close again after 8 years away had felt like a gift. The calls stopped connecting cleanly in the second week. Eleanor's voice had changed in a way I couldn't name. Exactly, shorter answers, longer pauses before she spoke, a kind of flatness that I told myself was fatigue. She was 59 years old and running a farm kitchen garden in August heat. I told myself that was all it was. I stopped calling as much. I told myself that too. Now turning off State Route 28 onto the gravel county road that ran the last 6 miles to our property, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in days. The fields on either side were deep late summer green. A red-tailed hawk sat on a fence post and watched my truck pass without moving. The air coming through the cracked window smelled like cut grass and something faintly sweet from the apple orchard down the hill to the north. I was almost home. The first thing I noticed was the gate lock. I had used the same master lock on that farm gate for 22 years. A brass-bodied lock dented along the shackle from a winter when a branch came down on it in an ice storm. I knew the weight of it in my palm. I knew the way the combination caught on the second number if you turned too fast. The lock hanging on the gate chain was a schlag. Brand new, the silver finish, still sharp in the afternoon light. not a scratch on it. I sat in my truck for a long moment, engine idling, staring at that lock. Then I pulled my phone out and found my spare gate key on the ring and realized it wouldn't fit. I had to get out and search through my toolbox for the bolt cutters I'd kept behind the seat, and I cut the chain rather than the lock because some part of me wanted to keep the schlag intact. I didn't know why at the time. I pushed through the gate and drove the last quarter-mile to the house. The wooden sign that had hung at the entrance to the farm lane since my father put it up in 1973, a hand-painted board reading Hayes Farm, in letters my mother had done in forest green, was gone. The 2 screws it had hung from were still in the post, and the patch of wood behind where the sign had been was lighter than the rest, bleached pale from decades of being shielded from the sun. Eleanor's kitchen garden was in front of me as I pulled to a stop. She had planted 4 rows of beefsteak tomatoes this year, staked and caged along the south fence where they got the best afternoon light. She talked about those tomatoes the way other women talked about grandchildren. She checked them every morning with her coffee. She had a notebook where she recorded the daily temperature and the rainfall amounts and the exact date each variety first set fruit. Every plant in those 4 rows was hanging dead on its cage. The fruit had split and rotted where it hung dark and collapsed, drawing fruit flies in slow spiraling clouds above the rows. The soil around the bases was cracked and pale. The tomatoes had not been watered in at minimum a week, and Eleanor Hayes had not missed a watering day in 31 years of keeping that garden. My legs felt strange when I got out of the truck. Not weak exactly, but uncertain, like the ground was making a decision about whether to hold me. The screen door to the mudroom was closed, but unlatched, swinging slightly in the breeze. I pushed through it and into the kitchen. The smell hit me before anything else, not bad, not spoiled, but closed. The smell of a house where no windows had been opened in a long time. The kind of air that had been breathed and rebreathed until it went flat. I found her in the living room. Eleanor was sitting in the wingback chair by the window, the chair she usually read and the one that caught the west light in the late afternoon. She was not reading. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the window glass, past the dead garden, past the tree line at the edge of the field. She had lost weight. I could see it in her face and the way her collar sat loose around her neck. Her hair was combed but not styled, and her hands that were always moving, always reaching for something, always working, were completely still in her lap. "Eleanor," my voice came out rough. She turned her head toward me, and the look on her face cracked something open in my chest. It was not the face of a woman startled out of a daydream. It was the face of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and had stopped being sure the waiting would end. "Walter." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and it broke on the second syllable of my name. She was out of the chair before I could move to her, crossing the room in 3 quick steps and pressing her face against my chest. And the sound she made was not quite crying. It was something thinner and more desperate than crying, like a person surfacing after being held underwater. Her hands gripped the front of my shirt and held on, and I could feel her shaking against me, fine tremors running through her shoulders and arms. I wrapped both arms around her and held her as tight as I dared. "I'm here," I said. "Eleanor, I'm right here." She pulled back just enough to look up at me, her eyes red and swollen, her cheeks wet. She opened her mouth to say something, and then she stopped, and her gaze moved past my shoulder to the window that faced the driveway. Her grip on my shirt tightened until her knuckles went white. "Is Victoria still outside?" she whispered, and the way she said our daughter's name, quiet, careful, like a word that might detonate if she spoke it too loud, sent a cold and specific fear straight through the center of my chest. I looked past Eleanor's shoulder through the window. The driveway was empty. Victoria's car, a silver Audi she'd driven up from the city when she came home 2 months ago, was gone. The only vehicle outside was my truck still running, driver's door hanging open where I'd left it. "She's not here," I said. "It's just us, Eleanor, just you and me." The breath that came out of my wife then was the kind that a person holds for days. It shuddered out of her in one long, ragged exhale, and she sagged against me like something structural had finally given way. I tightened my arms around her and walked her back to the wingback chair and sat her down, and I pulled the footstool over and sat directly in front of her so our knees were almost touching. I took both her hands in mine. Her hands were ice cold. The house was warm, late August in upstate New York, held its heat well into the evening, but Eleanor's fingers were the temperature of someone who had been standing outside in January. I rubbed them between my palms slowly the way I used to when she'd come in from the winter barn chores before we could afford the heated gloves. "Tell me what happened," I said. She shook her head and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Not the desperate surfacing tears. From a moment ago, these were quieter and more exhausted. The tears of someone who had been crying so long, the body had streamlined the process. "Eleanor." I kept my voice low and steady the way I talked to the cattle when something had spooked them. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here in this chair, and I'm not moving until you're ready. But I need you to talk to me." She pulled one hand free and pressed it against her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. She stared at the middle distance between us, and I watched her face cycle through something I couldn't fully read, shame I thought and exhaustion, and something else underneath both of those that looked a lot like relief. "She said you'd been forgetting things," Eleanor finally said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough at the edges like paper that had gotten wet and dried wrong. "Victoria, she said the stress of the farm was getting to you, that you'd been making mistakes with the finances, that the bank had called her." I kept my hands around hers and kept my face neutral. "What else did she say?" Eleanor's chin trembled. "She said you hadn't been sleeping, that you'd told her things were worse than you'd let on to me. She showed me something on her phone. She said it was an email from the bank about the farm loan." She stopped and pressed her lips together hard, fighting for control. "Walter, I didn't know what to believe. She's our daughter. I thought, why would she make something like that up?" "What did the email say?" "That there were irregularities in the farm account." Eleanor's voice broke on the last word, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth again, hard like she was physically holding the rest of it in. "She said if we didn't act quickly, we could lose the farm. She said she was trying to help us before you got home, so you wouldn't have to deal with the stress of it." I felt something move through my chest that I did not let reach my face. I breathed through it slowly. Eleanor looked at me. She lifted her eyes to mine. They were swollen and red-rimmed, the skin beneath them dark with what looked like weeks of poor sleep. "How long has Victoria been telling you these things?" "Since—" She stopped, counted backwards silently. "Since the third day after you left. She came over in the morning, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she had a folder with her." Eleanor's hand tightened on mine until I could feel the bones of her fingers pressing together. "Every day after that, she had something new, something worse. I tried to call Ruth once just to talk to someone, and Victoria said the phone was acting up. She'd take it in to get looked at. She took the phone, Walter, both phones. She said she'd have them back in a day or two. She took both phones. She brought them back." Eleanor said it quickly, defensively, like she was bracing for a reaction she'd been dreading. "She brought them back after a few days. She said they were fine. She'd had them updated. By then, I didn't have anyone's number memorized. Everything was in the contacts, and the contacts were—" She stopped again, and this time the tears came fast and hard, her whole face crumpling. "I didn't know your number by heart, Walter. I've had it in that phone for 15 years, and I never learned it by heart, and I didn't know how to reach you, and I didn't know what was true anymore, and I was so scared and so tired, and I just wanted you to come home." She was crying fully now, her shoulders heaving, her free hand pressing hard against her sternum, like she was trying to hold her chest together from the outside. I moved from the footstool to the arm of her chair and put my arm around her and held on. "I'm here," I said, against the top of her head. "Eleanor, I'm right here. I came home." "I know." Her voice was muffled against my shoulder. "I knew you would. I kept telling myself he's going to come home, and when he comes home, he'll know what to do." We sat like that for a long time, her crying herself toward empty me, holding her and thinking about phone contacts and folders full of documents and a daughter I thought I knew. When Eleanor's breathing had steadied enough that she could speak again, I asked her carefully, "Did Victoria ask you to sign anything?" Her whole body went rigid against mine. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, a tension that moved through her like a current, starting at her shoulders and running all the way down to her hands. She pulled back and looked at me, and the expression on her face hit me somewhere behind my sternum like a physical blow. It was the face of someone confessing to something they'd been sick over for weeks. Her eyes filled again, immediately spilling over before she could blink. "Walter?" she said, and her voice cracked down the middle of my name. "Walter, I am so sorry. She said it was to protect the farm. She said it was just paperwork. She sat with me at night at this table, and she was so calm and so sure, and I was so tired, and I thought, Baas bidao spa. Eleanor. I took her face in both my hands gently, the way you hold something you are terrified of dropping. Stop. Listen to me. Whatever you signed, we will fix it. You hear me? Whatever it is, we will fix it together. But right now, I need you to take a breath. She pressed her hands over mine, where they cupped her face, and she breathed in and out, her eyes closed, tears running sideways across my fingers. I need to lie down, she said finally. I know it's early, but I just need to close my eyes for a little while. Go, I said. I'll be right here. I walked her down the hallway to the bedroom and helped her sit on the edge of the bed, and I took off her shoes the way you would for a child, or for someone who was very old or very sick. And I pulled the blanket up over her, and I sat on the edge of the mattress until her breathing deepened and smoothed out, and I was reasonably sure she was asleep. Then I went back down the hallway through the kitchen and out the back door to the driveway. The evening air hit me full in the face, warm and smelling of the dead tomato plants, and I stood there with my fists clenched at my sides and my jaw tight and my heart running too fast in my chest. Victoria's Audi had been in this driveway every single day. 3 weeks, every single day. I went to the garage and pulled open the side door and found what I was looking for mounted in the upper corner behind the old shelving unit, the small black camera housing I had installed 2 years ago after someone had broken into the equipment shed and taken a chainsaw and 2 sets of irrigation fittings. A wireless camera motion-activated feeding to an app on my phone, a camera I had never mentioned to Victoria, a camera she did not know existed. My hands were steadier than I expected when I pulled out my phone and opened the app. 3 weeks of footage, hundreds of clips. I sat down on the old wooden stool in the corner of the garage and I started from the very beginning. The first clip was time-stamped 7:14 in the morning, the day after I left for Colorado. Victoria's silver Audi was already in the driveway. I sat on the wooden stool in the corner of the garage with my phone in both hands and watched the footage the way I used to watch weather systems moving in from the west, carefully looking for the thing underneath the thing, the real shape of what was coming before it arrived. The camera was motion-activated and wireless, mounted in the upper corner of the garage behind a set of old metal shelving units that had been there since my father's time. I had installed it 2 years ago after someone had helped themselves to a chainsaw and 2 complete sets of drip irrigation fittings from the equipment shed one night in October. I had told Eleanor about the camera in the equipment shed. I had not mentioned this one. There was no particular reason for the secrecy at the time. I had simply mounted it, tested the app, and moved on to the next task. It had never recorded anything more interesting than the occasional deer cutting through the yard. Until 3 weeks ago. I watched Victoria get out of her car at 7:14 in the morning on a Tuesday and walk directly to the front door of the house without pausing, without looking around, moving with the comfortable certainty of someone who had already decided she lived here. She was carrying a leather portfolio, the kind with a zipper around 3 sides that lawyers and real estate agents use thick enough to hold a substantial number of documents. I moved to the next clip, 7:52 a.m. same day. Victoria coming back out to her car, returning with a small cardboard box, hardware store logo on the side. She went back inside. I moved to the clip from 8:31 a.m. Victoria came back out the front door and walked to the gate at the end of the farm lane. She stood at the gate for a moment, examining my old master lock, turning it over in her hand. Then she went back to her car and drove away. I sat very still on that stool. She came back at 11:47 a.m. with a plastic bag from a hardware store in Cooperstown. She went to the gate. She was there for less than 4 minutes. When she walked back to the house, she was not carrying the bag anymore. That was the Schlager. That was day 1. I forced myself to breathe slowly and move through the next dozen clips, Victoria arriving each morning, always before 9, always with something in her hands. A folder, a box, a bag. Eleanor visible sometimes in the background of clips that caught the front porch moving slowly, her posture different from the Eleanor I knew, shoulders rounded, steps uncertain, like a woman walking on ice she wasn't sure would hold. Then I found the clip from day 6. Ruth Hennings, my neighbor of 30 years, walking up the farm lane, carrying something covered in a kitchen towel. Apple pie, I would find out later. Ruth walked up to the front door and knocked. and Victoria appeared in the doorway within seconds too fast, like she had been watching for visitors. The camera's audio was limited, but I could see Victoria's face clearly enough, a wide, warm smile, a hand raised in a gesture of apology, a slow shake of her head. Ruth said something. Victoria responded, gestured toward the inside of the house, shook her head again. Ruth stood there for a moment, holding her pie, and the look on her face was the look of a woman who has been told something that doesn't quite fit the shape of what she knows to be true. Then she turned around and walked back down the lane. The next morning at 6:42 a.m., Victoria carried Ruth's pie out to her car and put it in the back seat. My jaw was clenched so tight by this point that I could feel the tension running up through my temples. I got up from the stool and walked out of the garage because I needed to move, needed to put my feet on the ground and remind myself where I was and what I was doing. The night air outside was thick and warm, the kind of August night in upstate New York that smells like the land is still breathing from the heat of the day. I took the flashlight from the hook by the garage door and walked the property the way I had walked it every evening for 38 years, except that tonight I was not checking on things I trusted. I was documenting things that had been done to me. The irrigation system was the first thing I looked at properly. I had checked it briefly when I arrived, but now I crouched down at the main valve junction on the east side of the cornfield and looked at what had been done to it. The directional valves on sectors 3 and 4 had been turned 90 degrees from their correct positions. It was not a complicated adjustment. Anyone who spent 20 minutes reading the labels on the valve housing could do it. But the result was that for some period of the last 3 weeks, the east cornfield had been receiving no water at all, while the water pressure pushed uselessly against closed valves. I stood up and shone my flashlight across the east field. Even in the dark, I could see the difference. The corn on the west side stood tall and full, heavy-eared and healthy. The corn on the east side was shorter, the stalks thinner, the leaves beginning to curl at the edges from drought stress. A field that should have been ready to harvest in 3 weeks. I estimated the damage at somewhere between $35,000 and $45,000 in lost yields, depending on how long the valves had been wrong. I moved to the dairy barn next. The 12 cattle were restless in the heat, shifting and lowing softly as I came in. I checked the feed records on the clipboard by the door. Victoria had been filling them out in handwriting I didn't recognize as hers. At first too careful and deliberate, like she was copying a signature. The feed ratios were off. Not dramatically, not enough to cause immediate harm, but enough that the 2 highest producing cows would have been under nutritional stress for at least the past 10 days. Reduced feed in dairy cattle meant reduced milk production, which meant reduced income from the co-op contract, which meant that when someone went to the bank and said Walter Hayes' farm was in financial trouble, there would be numbers to point to. Numbers that Victoria had manufactured. I stood in the barn with the cattle moving softly around me and felt something cold and clarifying move through my chest. This was not a daughter who had gotten greedy and made some impulsive bad decisions. This was a plan that had required research preparation and an understanding of how a working farm's finances operated and how they could be quietly undermined. Back in the garage, I picked up my phone and kept going through the footage. Day 10. A woman I didn't recognize arriving in a dark blue sedan, carrying a briefcase. She went inside with Victoria. 45 minutes later, she came back out and drove away. I would find out what that visit meant soon enough, but looking at the leather briefcase and the business casual clothes, and the way she moved efficient, purposeful here to execute a specific task and leave, I had a feeling that settled in my stomach like cold water. Day 12. 11:47 in the evening. A black BMW sedan pulled to a stop at the edge of the farm lane just past the gate. The driver's side door opened. A man got out. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in the kind of clothes that said Manhattan, even in the dark, dark slacks, a jacket despite the August heat shoes that had no business being on a gravel farm road. Victoria came out of the house and walked to meet him. They stood together at the edge of my property for 11 minutes. The man pointed toward the east field, the field where I had just stood, and estimated $40,000 in damage. Victoria nodded. The man said something and gestured broadly, sweeping his arm from the east fields to the north orchard, and Victoria nodded again with the specific nod of someone confirming something that has already been agreed upon. I took a screenshot of the man's face. I took a screenshot of the license plate on the BMW. Then I opened the browser on my phone and typed the plate number into a reverse lookup service I had used once before, when someone had been dumping trash on the county road near our property line. The registration came back in less than 30 seconds. The name on the registration hit me like stepping off a ladder in the dark and finding the ground a step lower than you expected. I knew that name. I had asked the man it belonged to leave my kitchen 3 years ago. The registration had come back in under 30 seconds, and the name on it was one I already knew. I had met Richard Cole 3 times. He had come to this farm in the fall of 2021 with a leather portfolio and a tablet full of renderings. He had come back twice more after that each time, with a higher number and a different angle. The last time I had met him at the gate and not let him past it. What I had not known until this moment was that while I was refusing him at the front, he had found another way in. I went back through the footage more carefully after that, looking for every clip that showed Cole's BMW. He had been here 4 times in 3 weeks, always after dark, always meeting Victoria, outside never coming to the door. Always the same body language, the relaxed authority of a man who believed the outcome was already settled and the remaining steps were formalities. I had already seen the clip from day 19, the manila envelope, the document, the laugh that had done something to my chest. I still did not have a word for. I was beginning to understand what the envelope contained, but I needed to see the rest of the footage first. I kept going. The clip from day 8 showed Pastor Whitfield from our church, arriving on foot the way he always did when he came to visit. He lived less than a mile down the road and said the walk kept him honest. Victoria met him at the door the same way she had met Ruth, the same warm smile, the same apologetic head shake. The pastor stood on the porch for longer than Ruth had, and I could see from the set of his shoulders that he was pushing back on whatever Victoria was telling him. Eventually he turned and walked back down the lane, and the way he moved slowly, pausing once to look back at the house, told me he had left, with the same uneasy feeling Ruth had carried away with her apple pie. Victoria had cut Eleanor off from every person who might have helped her. She had done it one front door at a time, with a smile in broad daylight. I set the phone down on the workbench and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. My hands were shaking, not the fine tremor of cold or exhaustion, but a deep structural shaking, the kind that comes from the body, understanding something the mind is still trying to refuse. 38 years. I had poured 38 years into this land. My father had poured 30 years before that. And my daughter had come home and spent 3 weeks quietly, methodically, and cheerfully taking it apart. I picked the phone back up. There was one more clip I needed to find. I scrolled to day 10 and found it Eleanor alone in the kitchen at 2 in the afternoon, sitting at the table, and across from her, Victoria with the leather portfolio open and documents spread between them. Victoria was talking, her posture relaxed and reassuring, one hand moving in a calm, explanatory gesture. Eleanor was listening with her hands folded in her lap and her shoulders pulled in tight, and even through the limited angle of the garage, camera catching the kitchen window, I could see on my wife's face the expression of a person who is very tired and very frightened and wants very badly to believe that the person across the table is telling the truth. I watched Eleanor pick up the pen. I watched her sign. I closed the app and put the phone in my shirt pocket and walked out of the garage into the night air. The field stretched out in front of me in the dark, silent, and enormous. Somewhere in the east corn, something small moved through the dry stalks and rustled away. I pulled out the notepad I kept in my back pocket for farm notes, and I wrote 4 words at the top of a fresh page. She does not know. Underneath that, I started a list. Richard Cole. I said the name out loud in the empty garage just to hear what it sounded like in the dark. It sounded exactly as wrong as I expected. Richard Cole had first come to this farm in the fall of 2021. He had driven up in that same black BMW, walked into my kitchen uninvited, and sat down at my table with the easy confidence of a man who believed that every piece of land on earth had a price, and that the only variable was finding the right moment to name it. He had a leather portfolio renderings on a tablet, projected revenue figures printed on heavy stock paper. He wanted to build a luxury organic resort, 60 rooms, a farm-to-table restaurant, weekend wellness retreats for people from the city who wanted to feel connected to the land without actually working it. He had shown me photographs of what my family's farm could look like once it stopped being my family's farm. I had asked him to leave. He had come back 14 months later with a higher number and a different angle. Something about a tax structure that would allow me to retain a minority stake, while Cole's development group assumed operational control. I had not let him pass the porch steps that time. He had come a third time 8 months after that. I had seen his BMW coming up the lane and met him at the gate. And now here he was on my camera footage, standing at the edge of my property at 11:47 in the evening, pointing at my fields with my daughter beside him. I had watched him 4 times on that footage over 3 weeks, always after dark. Always the same posture of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. The laugh from day 19 was still sitting somewhere behind my sternum, the kind of thing that does not move when you want it to. Now I needed to know who he was beyond what the camera had shown me. I set the phone down and opened the browser and typed his name into the search bar. Richard Cole, Manhattan. Real estate developer specializing in agricultural land conversion, upstate New York and New England. His company website was professional and expensive looking, full of photographs of properties that had once been working farms and were now luxury destinations. Exposed beam ceilings, organic kitchen gardens maintained by staff fire pits, surrounded by Adirondack chairs at the edges of fields that no longer grew anything for market. I found the news article from California on the 3rd page of results. Napa Valley 2019. Cole had been investigated for fraudulent real estate acquisition involving an elderly vineyard owner and a family member acting as intermediary. The investigation had been closed without charges. The article quoted the district attorney saying there was insufficient direct evidence to proceed, but that the office remained concerned about the pattern of transactions. Pattern. I read that word twice. I kept searching. Dutchess County, New York, 2022. A farm family not named in the article had filed a civil complaint against a real estate development company, Cole's company, though his name appeared only in the corporate filing, not in the article itself, alleging that a family member had been used to facilitate a property transfer under false pretenses. The matter had been settled out of court. I sat back on the wooden stool and looked at the wall of the garage and thought about the word pattern. Cole did not approach elderly landowners directly. He found someone already inside the family, someone with access, someone with the trust of the people he wanted to take, from someone who could open doors that would otherwise stay closed. He had done it in California. He had done it in Dutchess County. And he had found Victoria, my daughter, 36 years old, 8 years away from home, carrying debts I did not yet know the full extent of. And he had found in her exactly what he needed. I thought about the timeline. Victoria had come home in late June, 2 weeks before I left for Colorado, saying she wanted to be closer to family, saying she wanted to help with the farm. She had been warm and present and helpful in those 2 weeks, and I had felt nothing but glad. I picked up my phone and opened the camera footage again, scrolling back to the very first clip. 7:14 in the morning. Day 1 of my absence. Victoria's car in the driveway before 8 a.m. portfolio. In hand, moving with the certainty of someone who had already been here many times in her mind before she arrived in person. This had not begun when I left for Colorado. This had begun long before that. I put my phone in my shirt pocket and stood up from the stool and walked out of the garage into the warm August night. The stars were sharp and plentiful, the way they only got this far from the city lights. The Milky Way a faint smear above the north field. I had stood under this sky 10,000 times. It had never looked the same as it did right now. I went back inside, past the kitchen up the stairs, and stopped outside the bedroom door. Eleanor's breathing was slow, and even on the other side. She was asleep. I went back down to the kitchen and pulled open the desk drawer and found the small notebook I kept there for farm calculations, acreage yield estimates, equipment costs. I turned to a blank page near the back. At the top, I wrote what I know. Underneath that, I began to write everything down, in order as precisely as I could, the way my father had taught me to document a problem before you try to solve it. I wrote for a long time. When I was done, I turned to the next blank page. At the top, I wrote what comes next, and I began a different kind of list. The notebook went back in the drawer at midnight. I was not done thinking, but I had written down everything I knew, and writing it down had given it a shape I could work with. Now, I needed to find the rest of it, the parts that were still hidden in the house around me in the drawers and folders and envelopes that Victoria had moved through while I was gone. I started in the kitchen. Eleanor kept a wooden bowl on the table by the front door, her system for incoming mail unchanged for 30 years. Every piece of mail went into that bowl until it was dealt with. I went through it piece by piece in the lamplight. Bills, a seed catalog, 2 pieces of junk mail addressed to occupant, and underneath all of it, 2 envelopes from Cooperstown Community Bank that had been opened and refolded with a crease that was not Eleanor's. She always opened envelopes along the top with the brass letter knife that had been her mother's. These had been torn along the side quickly by someone who was not careful about it. I pulled the letters out and read them at the kitchen table. The first was a notification that a request had been received to restructure the farm's operating loan. The request had been submitted by email and was listed as pending verification. The second was a transaction summary, 3 ATM withdrawals from the farm checking account over the previous 2 weeks, $300, $400, $250, all from the Pioneer Street branch machine in Cooperstown, all between 10 in the morning and noon on days I had been in Colorado. I set both letters on the table and went to the small office off the hallway. The filing cabinet was locked, which was normal, but the faceplate around the keyhole had a scratch on it that had not been there when I left, faint the kind of mark left by a key that was not quite the right key being worked in carefully until it turned. Someone with the patience to pick a lock or the resourcefulness to find a copy of the key had been through this cabinet. I unlocked it with my key and went through the files one folder at a time. I found the power of attorney in the farm insurance folder between 2 renewal notices as if it had always lived there. I sat down in the desk chair and read it carefully from the first line to the last. A power of attorney is a legal document by which one person, the principal, grants another person, the agent, the legal authority to make decisions and take actions on the principal's behalf. In New York State, a power of attorney that covers financial decisions and real property transactions must meet specific requirements to be valid. It must be signed by the principal. It must be witnessed by 2 people who are not named as agents in the document. And it must be notarized, signed, and stamped by a licensed notary public who has verified the identity of the principal and confirmed that the signature was given voluntarily. The document I was holding met every one of those requirements. Eleanor's signature was at the bottom of the page in her handwriting, shaky in a way that her handwriting had not been shaky the morning I left for Colorado. 2 witness signatures I did not recognize. A notary stamp and seal from a notary public licensed in Otsego County. The document granted Victoria Hayes full legal authority over all financial decisions related to the Hayes farm property. It granted her the power to enter into contracts on the farm's behalf, to manage and direct farm bank accounts, and in the language near the bottom of the 3rd page, buried in a paragraph dense with subordinate clauses, to execute real estate transactions, including the sale or transfer of real property. My wife had signed a document giving our daughter the legal power to sell our farm, and every formality had been observed to make sure it would hold. I folded the document and put it in my shirt pocket. Then I kept looking. At the back of the insurance folder, behind the power of attorney, I found something that had not been filed there by Victoria. It was a single sheet of yellow legal paper folded once. Eleanor's handwriting, not the careful, deliberate handwriting she used for letters, but the fast, unsteady writing she used when she was upset and writing quickly because she needed to get something down before she lost her nerve. At the top, she had written what I signed, in case you need to know. Below that was a list, the power of attorney, a document authorizing Victoria as a secondary signatory on the farm checking account, a form related to the farm's operating loan, though Eleanor had written, "I don't know exactly what this one was," beside it in smaller letters. And at the bottom of the list, in writing smaller, still as if she had not wanted to make it too real by writing it too large. I think one of them was about the house. "I am so sorry, Walter. I didn't know how to stop her. I tried to understand what I was signing, but she was always right there, and I was so tired, and I couldn't think clearly, and I am so sorry." I sat with that piece of paper in my hands for a long time. The refrigerator hummed, the clock on the wall moved. Outside, the summer night made its summer sounds, insects, a distant dog, the low, contented sound of the dairy herd settling in the barn. When I finally stood up, my legs felt older than they had when I sat down. I carried the yellow paper to the kitchen and set it on top of the bank letters on the table. Then I went to the junk drawer and found the thumb drive I kept there for backing up the farm's financial records, and I took it to the garage and plugged it into my phone and began copying 3 weeks of camera footage onto it. I worked until 4 in the morning. When I was done, I had everything I could find, It was not everything that had been done. I suspected there were layers I hadn't reached yet, documents I hadn't located, transactions I didn't know about. But it was enough to start. I put the thumb drive and the bank letters and Eleanor's yellow paper and the power of attorney in the manila envelope I found in the office drawer, and I wrote Carlton Pewett's name on the front of it, and I set it by the back door, where I would not forget it in the morning. Then I turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark at my father's table for a little while, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting in the house where I had lived my whole adult life, listening to it breathe around me. Eleanor had fallen asleep sometime around midnight, her breathing finally evening out into something slow and regular. I had eased my arm out from under her, pulled the blanket up and gone downstairs, and I had been at that kitchen table ever since, working through the documents, copying the footage, writing down everything I knew. It was past 4 in the morning now. The coffee was cold. The house was quiet in the particular way that houses get quiet in the last hour before dawn, when even the settling of the walls seems to pause. I pushed the papers aside and pulled a fresh yellow legal pad toward me. The kitchen at 3 in the morning has a different quality than it does at any other hour. The refrigerator hum is louder. The dark outside the windows is total. Every object in the room sits in its own pool of lamplight and seems more itself than it does in the bustle of the day. The wooden table my father built in 1968, the row of Eleanor's canning jars along the shelf above the stove, the hook by the back door where my father's old work coat still hung, because neither Eleanor nor I had ever been able to bring ourselves to move it. I sat down at that table with a yellow legal pad and a pen and a cup of coffee I didn't particularly want, and I tried to think like a farmer instead of like a father. Farmers do not make good decisions when they are angry. I had learned that the hard way in my 30s during a contract dispute with a grain elevator that had shorted us on a payment, and I had responded by calling the manager names I was not proud of and losing the contract entirely. My father had sat me down afterward and said, "The land doesn't care how you feel. It only cares what you do." I had written that in a notebook and carried it with me since. Tonight I needed it more than I ever had. I wrote 4 names at the top of the legal pad: Carlton Pewett, Tom Briggs, Deputy Morrison, Daniel. Then I wrote a 5th line and underlined it 3 times. Victoria does not know I know. That line was the most important thing on the page. Everything else depended on it. I thought about what I had seen on that camera footage. Victoria arriving every morning with her leather portfolio, the schlag lock on the gate, Ruth Hennings walking away with her pie, Pastor Whitfield pausing at the end of the lane to look back at the house with that troubled, uncertain expression, my daughter and Richard Cole standing in my driveway at midnight, pointing at fields that did not belong to either of them yet, and Eleanor at the kitchen table, at 2 in the afternoon, picking up a pen. Something moved through my chest that I had to breathe through carefully and deliberately until it settled. Not rage exactly, something colder than rage and more focused. The feeling a man gets when he has been hit and the shock has passed and he understands exactly what happened and exactly who did it and exactly what he is going to do about it. I am not a violent man. I want to be clear about that. Sitting at that kitchen table at 3 in the morning, I was not thinking about violence. I was thinking about Carlton Pewett's office at 7:30. About the filing cabinet where I had found the power of attorney document, about the thumb drive in the junk drawer that I could use to copy the camera footage before Victoria had any reason to suspect I had found it. I was thinking about doing this right, because doing it right was the only way to make sure it stayed done. I wrote down everything I still needed to verify before Victoria arrived in the morning. Checked that the camera footage had copied cleanly to the thumb drive. Confirmed the bank statements were in the envelope. Make sure Eleanor's old iPhone was fully charged so the recordings would not be lost. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Victoria was my daughter. I had held her in the delivery room at Cooperstown Memorial Hospital when she was 40 minutes old. I had taught her to drive a tractor on this property when she was 12 years old, standing behind her with my hands on her shoulders, both of us laughing when she stalled it in the lower field. I had driven her to the airport 8 years ago when she left for Los Angeles, and I had stood in the departure lane and felt nothing but pride, because I had no idea who had come back. The woman on those recordings, the woman in that camera footage, the woman who had sat at this exact table and watched my wife pick up a pen and sign away our home, that woman had been planning this for longer than 3 weeks. She had come home with a folder and a strategy and a contact at a real estate development firm, and she had spent 21 days executing that strategy with a patience and a precision that I might have admired if it hadn't been aimed directly at the people I loved most. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw light, then dropped them back to the table. Outside, headlights swept across the kitchen window. I went still. A car was coming up the county road, slowing as it approached the farm lane. I watched through the window as the headlights paused at our entrance, then moved on past, and continued down the road. A neighbor coming home late. Nothing more. But my heart was running hard, and it took a full minute to slow back down. I looked at my watch. 4:47 in the morning. I had been sitting at this table for almost 2 hours, and the sky outside the east window was still fully dark, but in another hour it would begin to gray at the edges, and after that, the morning would come fast, whether I was ready for it or not. I stood up, rolled up my sleeves, and started with the thumb drive. By the time the first pale light began to show above the tree line to the east, I had everything I needed. I poured the cold coffee down the drain, and put the kettle on for a fresh pot, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up over my cornfields, the healthy ones on the west side, the damaged ones on the east. And I made myself a quiet and specific promise to the land, and to the woman sleeping upstairs, and to the memory of the man whose coat still hung by the back door. I was going to fix this, every single piece of it. I cooked breakfast at 5:30 in the morning, the way I had cooked it on every important day of our marriage. Scrambled eggs with sharp cheddar, toast from Eleanor's sourdough loaf, buttered while it was still hot. A glass of orange juice squeezed from the navels we kept in the mesh basket by the sink. It was the breakfast I had made the morning we signed the papers on this farm, the morning Eleanor came home from the hospital after her hip surgery 3 years ago, the morning after her mother's funeral. It was the meal that said, "I am here and I am not going anywhere, and whatever today brings, we will face it on a full stomach." I carried the tray upstairs and knocked softly on the bedroom door. Eleanor was already awake, sitting up against the headboard, with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, staring at the window. The early light was coming in, thin and pale, and it made her look older than she was and more fragile, and I had to set the tray down on the dresser for a moment before I trusted myself to carry it the rest of the way without my hands shaking. "You cooked?" she said. "I cooked," I said. She looked at the tray, and her face did something complicated. Her mouth pressed together, and her eyes filled, and she shook her head slowly, like she was arguing with herself about something. Then she pressed the back of her wrist hard against her mouth and breathed through her nose until she had it under control. "Walter," she said when she could, "I have to tell you something else." I sat on the edge of the bed and handed her the orange juice. "Tell me." "Victoria told me you had a bad heart." She said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. "She showed me something on her phone. She said it was a message from your doctor, that the stress of knowing what was happening with the farm could—" Her voice broke and she pushed through it. "She said if I told you it might kill you. That's why I didn't find a way to call. That's why I kept telling myself to just wait. I thought I was protecting you." The orange juice glass was in my hand and I set it down very carefully on the nightstand because I did not trust my grip. "Eleanor," I kept my voice level, "look at me." She looked up, her eyes spilling over. "I do not have a bad heart," I said. "I have never been told by any doctor that I have a bad heart. I had a physical 8 months ago, and Dr. Reeves told me I had the blood pressure of a man 20 years younger. That message Victoria showed you was not real." Eleanor pressed both hands over her face and made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a word. Something raw and exhausted that came from somewhere deeper than either. Her shoulders heaved once, twice, then steadied. "I believed her," she said from behind her hands. "I believed everything she said. She gave you reasons to," I said. "That's what she came here to do." I moved the tray to the nightstand and sat beside her and put my arm around her, and she leaned into me with her whole weight the way she hadn't done since we were young and the world was smaller and easier to manage. We sat like that, while she ate slowly, the color coming back into her face with each bite, and I watched her and thought about a woman who had shown her own mother a fabricated medical document to keep her from making a phone call. Outside, tires crunched on the gravel driveway. Eleanor heard it too. She went rigid against my side, her fork stopping halfway to her mouth, her eyes cutting to the window. "It's all right," I said. I was already standing, moving to the window. Victoria's silver Audi sat in the driveway below, engine still running. She was on her phone, not looking at the house. "Finish your breakfast," I said, turning back to Eleanor. My voice was calm and even, and came from a place I had not known I had until this week. "I'm going to go say good morning to our daughter." Eleanor caught my wrist as I passed the bed. Her grip was stronger than I expected. "Walter." Her eyes searched mine. "What are you going to do?" I covered her hand with mine. "Everything right," I said. "Nothing fast." Before I tell you what Eleanor had been hiding under her pillow for 8 days, and what Walter heard on that recording that changed everything, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. Because what comes next is the part nobody saw coming. Heads up, this story contains some fictional elements built for storytelling and educational value. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, you're free to step away anytime. Eleanor reached under the pillow with both hands. What she brought out was an iPhone with a cracked screen in the upper left corner. A crack I recognized because I had been there when it happened. Eleanor dropping the phone on the barn steps in the spring of 2019 and picking it up, saying it still works. It still works. No need to replace it. She had used it for about 6 months after that, before deciding she preferred the simplicity of the landline and putting it in the nightstand drawer where it had lived ever since. She held it out to me with both hands, and the deliberateness of the gesture, the care with which she presented it, like something she had been guarding, made my throat go tight in a way I had not anticipated. 8 days, she said. Starting on day 10, I recorded 8 days of conversations. I took the phone from her carefully. "How did you know to do that?" I said. Eleanor's chin lifted slightly, not with pride exactly, but with the particular dignity of a woman describing a decision she had made alone under pressure with no one to help her think it through. "I found the message on her phone," she said. "The one from Cole, 2.3 million, 60 days. Move faster on the old man." She pressed her lips together. She set her phone on the table when she went to the bathroom, and a message came through, and I read it before I thought about whether I should. And when she came back and picked up the phone, I could tell from her face that she didn't know I'd seen it. "You didn't tell her," I said. "I didn't tell her." Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap. That night I lay in bed thinking about what it meant. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know that whatever Victoria had been telling me, it wasn't the whole truth. And I thought, if Walter comes home and something has gone wrong, he is going to need more than my word against hers. She nodded toward the phone in my hands. "I remembered that old phone was in the drawer," she said. "I remembered it still connected to the house Wi-Fi because I'd used it to look something up once. I got it out that night after Victoria left, and I searched how to use the voice memo application. It took me about an hour to understand it properly." She paused. "I kept it in my apron pocket during the days and under my pillow at night. Every time Victoria sat down with me to go over papers or to talk, I turned it on first." I looked at the phone in my hands. The battery was at 11%. She had been using it carefully, conserving what was left. "Eleanor," I said. "Play them," she said. "You need to hear them." I plugged the phone into the charger on the nightstand and waited until the battery had enough charge to be reliable. Then I put the phone between us on the bed and pressed play on the first file. Victoria's voice filled the quiet bedroom. It was not a voice I recognized immediately as my daughter's, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. It was smoother than Victoria's natural speaking voice, slower, more deliberately modulated, the voice of someone who had thought carefully about how to sound before they began speaking. Warm without being effusive, concerned without being alarmed, the voice of someone managing a situation. "Mom, I know this feels like a lot," Victoria said in the first recording, "but the bank doesn't make these kinds of calls without reason. Dad has been under a lot of stress. You know how he pushes himself." Eleanor's voice thinner and more uncertain than I had ever heard it. "He's never said anything to me about the finances being because he doesn't want you to worry." Victoria's voice dropped into something confidential, almost gentle. "That's who Dad is. He carries everything alone. But Mom, the situation is more serious than he's let on. And if we don't act before he gets back, the options get a lot more limited." I stopped the recording. My jaw was clenched hard enough that I could feel the tension in my temples. I made myself breathe. I pressed play again. The third recording was worse. It was late after 9 in the evening, based on the quality of the quiet. Eleanor's voice in this one was exhausted in a way that made my chest ache to hear it. The voice of someone who had been worn down over many days and was running low on the reserves that resistance requires. I want to talk to Walter before I sign anything else, Eleanor said. Mom? Victoria's voice stayed gentle, but something underneath it had changed a new firmness, subtle and patient, like a door being pushed from the other side. If we wait for Dad, it'll be too late for the bank to hold the current terms. You know what happened with the loan renegotiation in 2019, how close that got. This is the same kind of situation, and the window is short. I don't know, Victoria. I know you don't. That's why I'm here. A pause. The sound of paper being moved on a table. You're not doing this alone, Mom. I'm right here. Just this one more signature, and then we're protected. All of us. 6 seconds of quiet. I counted them. Then the scratch of a pen on paper. I reached over and stopped the recording. I got up from the bed and walked to the window and stood there with my back to Eleanor, looking out at the fields in the early morning light. I needed a moment that was not visible to anyone. I needed 30 seconds to put something back in its place before it got away from me. When I turned around, Eleanor was watching me with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes dry and her face carrying the expression of a woman who has something else to say and is trying to decide if this is the right moment to say it. There's one more, she said. The last one, day 17. You should hear it. I came back to the bed and sat down and pressed play. In this recording, Victoria's voice had changed again, less careful, more direct, the way a person speaks when they believe they are no longer being observed, when the performance has been going long enough that they have stopped remembering it is a performance. Once everything transfers, Victoria said, the farm is in a structure that protects it going forward, from market fluctuations, from bad seasons. A pause. From Dad making the same decisions he's been making for 30 years. Another pause. It's better this way, Mom, for both of you. He just doesn't know it yet. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I looked at Eleanor and Eleanor looked at me, and I thought about how many times in 39 years of marriage I had been grateful to have married someone with the kind of backbone that does not announce itself, the kind that is simply there, holding everything up, whether anyone notices or not. New York State, I said quietly, is a one-party consent state. That means a recording made by one of the people in the conversations is legal. These recordings are admissible evidence. Eleanor nodded slowly. She had not known the legal terminology. She had not needed to. She had simply done the right thing because her instincts told her to. Carlton Pewitt is going to want to hear these, I said. I know, Eleanor said. That's why I kept the phone charged. Outside, the morning birds had started up in the apple trees along the north fence, the particular sound of an August dawn in upstate New York. The day was coming, whether we were ready for it or not. I held the phone carefully in both hands and thought about a woman alone in this house for 21 days, frightened and isolated and uncertain of what was true, teaching herself to operate a voice memo application in the dark, because something in her told her she was going to need it. Eleanor, I said. She looked at me. You saved this farm, I said. She shook her head slightly the way she did when she wanted to disagree without arguing. You came home, she said. That's what saved it. Victoria came back at 2 in the afternoon, the way she said she would. I was on the back porch when her Audi came up the lane, pretending to read the seed catalog that had been sitting on the side table since before I left for Colorado. I had been sitting there for 20 minutes, not reading a single word of it, running through the conversation ahead of me, the way I used to run through a difficult negotiation with a grain buyer, every possible angle, every likely response, every place where I might slip if I wasn't careful. I had one job for the rest of this day. One job only, make her believe nothing had changed. She came around the side of the house with her leather portfolio under her arm and a paper bag from the diner on Route 28 in her other hand. She held it up when she saw me. Thought I'd bring lunch, she said, smiling. Figured you probably haven't eaten since breakfast. You figured right, I said, and I smiled back, and I meant neither one of those things. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us again. Eleanor had come downstairs when she heard the car moving carefully, her face composed into something that must have cost her considerably. She ate half a sandwich and asked Victoria about the drive and whether the diner had changed their pie since last summer. Victoria said she thought they had a new baker. Eleanor said that explained it. I ate my sandwich and watched my daughter and thought about 38 years of reading weather. After lunch, Victoria unzipped her portfolio. I've been wanting to go over some things with you, she said, setting a folder on the table in front of me. Her voice was warm and measured the same careful tone I had heard on Eleanor's recordings. There are some ideas I've been developing about the farm's future, some opportunities I think are worth looking at seriously. I picked up the folder and opened it. Inside were printed projections, revenue charts, cost analyses, a comparison of the farm's current output versus what Victoria was calling optimized land use potential. The numbers had been carefully constructed to make the farm look like it was barely breaking even, which was not accurate but which would have been convincing to someone who didn't know the actual books. "This is interesting," I said in the voice of a man finding something mildly interesting. Victoria leaned forward. "Richard Cole has a proposal that I really think deserves a serious look, Dad. I know you've had reservations about him in the past, but the market has changed. Land values up here have gone up 30% in the last 4 years. What this farm could generate as a developed property versus what it generates now, it's not even close." "Cole," I said, and let a small frown cross my face, just enough to seem like the familiar resistance she would have expected from me, not enough to alarm her. "I don't know, Victoria. This land has been in the family a long time." "I know that." She put her hand over mine on the table, and I kept my hand still and my face open. "And I'm not saying give it up. I'm saying look at the options. Just sit down with Richard, hear what he has to say. If you don't like it, we walk away. But Dad, if we don't at least look and things get harder." She glanced at Eleanor, then back at me. "I just don't want you both to have fewer choices than you could have had." I looked at the folder for a long moment. Then I closed it and set it down. "Tell you what," I said. "Let me look this over tonight. I want to understand the numbers before I sit down with anyone. Can you give me until Friday?" Something moved behind Victoria's eyes, quick and bright, like a light turning on in a window at night. Friday. That was exactly what she wanted. "Friday is perfect," she said. Eleanor reached for her coffee cup at that exact moment, and I saw her hand trembling slightly around the handle, and I put my foot against hers under the table, gently, just enough pressure to say, "I see it. Hold on. We are almost through this." Her hand steadied. Victoria stayed another hour talking about the farm, about Los Angeles, about things that didn't matter, and I listened and responded and laughed in the right places, and gave her absolutely nothing to take back to Richard Cole, except the confirmation she had already been looking for. When she finally left, I walked her to her car again. She hugged me at the driver's door. "I love you, Dad," she said. "I love you too," I said. Both true, both completely beside the point now. I waited until her taillights disappeared around the bend. Then I went inside, and Eleanor was standing in the kitchen doorway, with her arms crossed tight across her chest, and her eyes bright, and her chin held up with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has held herself together through something very difficult and is not quite ready to stop yet. "She took it," Eleanor said. "Hook, line, and sinker," I said. Eleanor let out a breath that shook at the edges. "Friday," she said. "She's going to move everything on Friday." "She's going to try," I said. I picked up my phone from the counter. "Tomorrow morning I go to Carlton at 7:30, then the bank, then Morrison." I looked at Eleanor. 72 hours, that's all we need." Eleanor nodded. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were still bright, but she was not going to cry. I could see the decision in her face, the same decision she'd made every morning for 39 years when something on the farm went wrong. You assess, you plan, you work. "Then I'm going to bed early," she said, "because I want to be awake and clear-headed when this is over." She turned and went upstairs, her back straight, her hand trailing along the wall just slightly, not for balance, I thought, but for the feeling of something solid and real beneath her fingers. I stood in the kitchen of the house my father built and listened to her footsteps on the stairs, and I picked up my phone and I confirmed my 7:30 appointment with Carlton Pewett's office for the morning. 72 hours, not 1 minute more than we needed. Carlton Pewett's office was on the second floor of a building on Pioneer Street that had been a hardware store in my father's time and a law office for the 30 years since. The stairs creaked on the third step the same way they had creaked the first time I climbed them in 1989, when my father brought me along to sign the papers, transferring the farm deed into my name. Carlton had been a younger man, then newly partnered, his hair still dark. Now it was mostly silver, and he wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck. But the way he stood when I came through the door was the same, straight, unhurried, completely present. He shook my hand with both of his. "Sit down, Walter," he said. "Take your time." I sat. I put the manila envelope on the desk between us, thumb drive with the camera footage photographs of every document from the filing cabinet, 3 months of printed bank statements, and Eleanor's iPhone with the 8 days of recordings. Carlton looked at the envelope and folded his hands on top of his legal pad. "Tell me everything," he said. "Leave nothing out." He listened, the way Carlton always listened, leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, completely still. I had seen him do this once before 20 years ago, during a contract dispute with a building contractor who had walked off a barn repair job halfway through and tried to keep the deposit. Carlton had listened that same way, and when I finished, he had opened his eyes and told me exactly what to do, and he had been exactly right. I talked for 30 minutes. I told him about the camera footage, the schlugs, locked the damaged irrigation system. Ruth Hennings turned away at the door, Richard Cole in the driveway at midnight. The power of attorney buried in the insurance folder, the bank letters, the email sent from an address that was not mine, and every word on Eleanor's 8 days of recordings. When I got to the recordings, I set Eleanor's iPhone on the desk and played him 40 seconds. Victoria's voice smooth and patient and relentless, telling my wife that signing the document was the only way to protect the farm from debts I had supposedly run up. When the recording stopped, Carlton opened his eyes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and looked at me, the way he looked at a contract he was about to pull apart line by line. "Walter, I need you to understand something clearly," he said. "What you have described to me is not a family disagreement. It is not a misunderstanding that got out of hand. What your daughter has done constitutes multiple serious legal violations, and I need you to hear that plainly before we decide how to proceed." "Tell me all of it," I said. Carlton picked up his pen. "The power of attorney Eleanor signed can be challenged and voided under New York state law on the grounds of undue influence. Undue influence means a court finds that the document was obtained by applying sustained psychological pressure that compromised the signing party's free will and independent judgment. The recordings you have are exceptional evidence of exactly that. Victoria systematically broke down Eleanor's resistance over a period of days, isolated her from outside support, and presented false information to make her believe she had no other option." He wrote something on his legal pad. "A judge can void that document completely. It will be as if Eleanor never signed it." I let out a breath I had been holding since the night before. "The email to the bank is a separate matter," Carlton continued, "and in some ways a more serious one. Using electronic communication in this case, email to fraudulently represent yourself to a financial institution for the purpose of altering loan terms constitutes wire fraud under federal law, specifically Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code." He set his pen down. "That is not a state crime, Walter. That is a federal felony. It carries a maximum sentence of 20 years per count, and it gives the FBI concurrent jurisdiction alongside local law enforcement." The words landed in the room and stayed there. "Federal," I said. "Federal," Carlton confirmed. He looked at me steadily. "I also want to file for an emergency injunction this morning, a temporary restraining order to freeze any pending property transfers on the farm. Under New York law, I can have that in front of a judge within hours given the evidence we have. It puts a legal wall between Victoria and the deed while we build the full case." He folded his hands again. "But before I file anything, I have to ask you something, and I need your honest answer. There are people in your situation who choose to handle things quietly, recover the assets, avoid criminal charges, keep it within the family. And there are people who want every consequence the law allows." He held my gaze. "Both are legitimate choices. But once we start down one road, it is very difficult to come back." My answer was already formed before he finished the question. "Every consequence the law allows," I said. "Every single one." Carlton held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once slowly, like a man confirming something he had already suspected about the person sitting across from him. "Then we do this right," he said. He tore the top sheet from his legal pad and slid it across the desk. 3 names, 3 times, written in his careful, angular hand. Tom Briggs, 9:15 a.m. Deputy Morrison, 2 p.m. Carlton follow-up call, 5 p.m. 72 hours, he said. "I need 72 hours to coordinate with Morrison and get the warrant properly prepared. Can Victoria be kept from suspecting anything for that long? I thought about my daughter at my kitchen table yesterday afternoon, eating diner food and smiling, utterly certain she was 3 days away from everything she had come home for. Yes, I said, she can. Carlton stood and reached across the desk. Go see Tom Briggs, he said, then Morrison and Walter. He kept hold of my hand for a moment. Eleanor is lucky to have you paying attention. I walked down the creaking stairs and out onto Pioneer Street into the sharp morning light, and I turned toward the bank 2 blocks east, and I did not look back. Cooperstown Community Bank had been on the same corner of Main Street since 1941. Same brick facade, same green canvas awning, faded at the edges from 30 years of upstate winters. Same heavy glass door that threw rectangles of morning light across the marble floor when you pushed through it. I had walked through that door for 15 years. Tom Briggs had been the branch manager for 11 of those years, and in that time, he had approved 2 operating loans for the farm, helped us refinance after the bad harvest in 2019, and called me personally the one time a check had bounced due to a processing error so I could fix it quietly before it became a problem. He was waiting for me in the lobby when I arrived at 9:14, not at his desk, not behind the teller line. In the lobby itself, jacket-buttoned hands at his sides with the careful and controlled expression of a man who has been sitting on something uncomfortable for 2 weeks and is relieved to finally be able to put it down. Walter? He gripped my hand firmly. Come on back. He pulled the blinds on the conference room window before he sat down, which told me he had already thought carefully about who might see this conversation from the floor outside. I was going to call you today, he said, opening a folder on the table between us. I've been going back and forth about it for 2 weeks, and I'll tell you plainly, I am very glad you walked in here this morning. He turned the folder to face me. Inside was a printed email. The sender address read walter.hayes.farm@gmail.com. The subject line read Farm Loan Restructure Request, Hayes Property. The body of the email was 3 paragraphs long, written in a style that was close to mine, but not quite right too formal in places. The sentence rhythm slightly off, like someone who had read my previous correspondence carefully and tried to replicate it without catching the natural way I wrote. Attached to the email was a scanned document, a signature at the bottom that looked like mine. Was not mine. I didn't send this, I said. I know, Tom said. I suspected as much the moment it came in. The Gmail address was different from the one you'd used on previous correspondence. The loan restructure being requested would have significantly increased the bank's leverage over the property in a default scenario. It wasn't something you had ever expressed interest in, and it wasn't something I would have expected you to pursue without coming in to talk first. He folded his hands on the table. I tried to call you to verify. You were out of range. Most of the Colorado trip, I said. Bad cell coverage in the mountains. I left 2 voicemails. When I didn't hear back, I put the request in a pending file and marked it for manual verification before processing. He looked at me steadily. Something about it didn't feel right, Walter, so I waited. My hands were flat on the table, and I was keeping them there deliberately. There's more, Tom said. He pulled a second sheet from the folder, a transaction summary for the farm checking account. 3 ATM withdrawals, $300 on a Tuesday morning, $400 on a Thursday morning, $250 the following Monday, all from the Pioneer Street branch ATM, all between 10 and noon. I was in Colorado on every one of those dates, I said. I know. Tom closed the folder and looked at me directly. Walter, I need to ask you something straight. Do you know who accessed that account? I have a strong suspicion, I said. And I have evidence. I was at Carlton Pewett's office this morning. Carlton is filing for an emergency injunction on the property as we speak. He told me to come to you next and ask you to freeze both accounts immediately, the personal checking and the farm operating, and to pull the full transaction history for the past 60 days. Tom was already reaching for his phone before I finished the sentence. He spoke quietly and precisely to someone in the fraud department, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man giving instructions he has already thought through completely. The call lasted 4 minutes. When he set the phone down, he looked at me with an expression that had moved well past careful professionalism into something graver and more personal. Both accounts are frozen as of right now, he said. Nothing moves without your direct authorization in person with photo identification, verified by me personally. He slid a printed form across the table. I'll need your signature on this to confirm the freeze request. I signed it. Tom looked at the email printout for a moment, then back at me. Walter, I want to make sure you understand the full picture here. Using electronic communication to fraudulently represent yourself to a federally insured financial institution for the purpose of altering loan terms and gaining leverage over real property is wire fraud under federal law. I am required by federal banking regulations to report this to the appropriate federal authorities. That means the FBI field office in Albany will be notified likely by end of business today. Carlton told me the same thing this morning, I said. Deputy Morrison at the county sheriff's office is my next stop. Tom nodded. He gathered the documents carefully and slid them into a fresh folder, which he pushed across the table to me. Take these, he said. Copies of the email, the signature document, and the transaction summary. Carlton will want them. I took the folder. I started to stand, and Tom put his hand on the table, not stopping me, just a gesture that said he had one more thing to say. I grew up 2 miles down the road from your farm, he said. My father bought seed corn from your father for 15 years. When that email came in and something felt off about it, I could have told myself it wasn't my place to question it and process the request. He met my eyes. I didn't. I want you to know that, not because I want credit for it, but because I think you should know there are people in this town who are paying attention. The back of my throat tightened in a way I had not expected, and I had to look at the window for a moment before I could answer him. Tom, I said when I trusted my voice. Thank you. He stood and walked me to the door of the conference room. At the threshold, he stopped. Go see Morrison, he said quietly. And Walter, take care of Eleanor. I walked out of the bank into the late morning sun with 2 folders under my arm and 2 hours until my appointment with Deputy Morrison, and I stood on the Main Street sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the sky the way my father had taught me to look at it, not for what it was, but for what it was about to become. It was about to become something different than it had been. The Otsego County Sheriff's Office was a low brick building, set back from the road on County Highway 33, about 1.5 miles outside of town. I had driven past it 1,000 times in 38 years without ever going inside. I went inside now. The woman at the front desk made a call when I gave my name, and 2 minutes later, a door opened and Deputy Sarah Morrison came out to meet me in the waiting area. She was in her mid-40s, compact and direct in the way of someone who had learned early. That time was finite and vagueness was expensive. She wore her sheriff's department uniform with the easy comfort of someone who had put it on every morning for a long time. She shook my hand once firmly and looked at me with the particular attention of a person who had spent years listening to people describe things that had been done to them and had learned to hear what was underneath the words as much as what was in them. Mr. Hayes, she said, I'm glad you called. Come on back. Her office was small and organized with a precision that suggested she did not have patience for disorder. She had a whiteboard on one wall with case numbers written in columns, a filing cabinet with color-coded tabs, and a desk that held exactly what was needed and nothing else. She gestured me to the chair across from her and sat down and folded her hands on the desk. Carlton Pewitt called me this morning after your meeting, she said. He gave me the broad outline. I want to hear it from you directly in your own words from the beginning. I told her, again. This was the 3rd time in one day I had told the full story, and each time I told it, it became slightly more real and slightly more terrible, not because the facts changed, but because each person who heard it reflected something back to me that confirmed it had actually happened. Morrison listened without interrupting. When I finished, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a folder. I know the name Richard Cole, she said. She opened the folder and turned it to face me. Inside was a printed case summary, not from New York, but from Napa Valley, California, 2019. Richard Cole investigated for fraudulent real estate acquisition involving an elderly property owner and a family member, acting as intermediary. Case closed without charges due to insufficient direct evidence. He's done this before, I said. He's done something like this before, Morrison said carefully. Napa Valley wasn't enough to prosecute, but there was also a matter in Dutchess County 2 years ago, a farm family, similar circumstances, a relative who had been brought in to help manage the property and ended up facilitating a transfer to a development company Cole was associated with. That family settled civilly, no criminal charges. She closed the folder. Cole is careful. He structures these arrangements so that the person who takes the direct action, in that case, a nephew in your case, your daughter absorbs the legal exposure while he stays one step removed. Until now, I said. Until now, Morrison agreed. Because this time, there's an email in his name coordinating the timeline, and your daughter used an interstate wire communication to defraud a federally insured bank, which brings the federal statute into play. She picked up her pen. I spoke with the FBI field office in Albany this morning, after Carlton called. They are assigning an agent to this case. Wire fraud plus elder financial exploitation plus premeditated property fraud, that combination gets their attention. She pulled up something on her computer and turned the screen toward me. It was a business registration document from the state of Delaware, Hayes Farm, LLC, registered March 14th, 6 months before Victoria had come home. The registered agents were listed as Victoria Hayes and Richard Cole Development Group, LLC, with an address that matched the farm's county road location. Your daughter filed this 6 months before she came back, Morrison said, watching my face. She told you she wanted to help. She told Eleanor she was worried about the family, but 6 months before she knocked on your door, she had already incorporated a shell company in Delaware, using your farm's address and Richard Cole's development group as co-owner. She let that sit for a moment. That is not impulsive behavior, Mr. Hayes. That is premeditation. And in the context of the wire fraud charge, it establishes a pattern of deliberate planning that significantly strengthens the federal case. My jaw was tight, and I made myself unclench it. What happens now? I said. I am going to request an arrest warrant from the county judge today, Morrison said. Given the evidence you have provided, the camera footage, the recordings, the bank documentation, and the Delaware LLC registration, I expect the warrant to be signed by tomorrow morning. She looked at me steadily. The warrant covers both Victoria and Richard Cole. Cole's involvement in the Delaware LLC and his documented communication coordinating the timeline makes him a co-conspirator on the fraud charges. Victoria is planning to meet with Cole on Friday, I said. She thinks I'm going to sign transfer documents. Morrison nodded slowly. Then Friday is when we execute the warrant. We let her walk into that meeting believing everything is on schedule. She picked up her pen again. I want to be clear about something, Mr. Hayes. What we are doing is executing a lawful arrest warrant at a location where the subjects will be voluntarily present. There is no entrapment here. Victoria and Cole are choosing to be there. The warrant will be fully signed and authorized before they arrive. Everything will be done correctly. She stood and extended her hand across the desk. Go home, she said. Take care of your wife. Do not change anything in your behavior toward Victoria. If she calls, answer normally. If she comes by, let her. She paused. Can you do that for 2 more days? I thought about Eleanor at the kitchen table, her hand steadying around the coffee cup when I pressed my foot against hers. We can do it, I said. Morrison held my hand a moment longer than a standard handshake. Mr. Hayes, she said. What your wife did recording those conversations on her own without being told to, out of instinct, that recording is going to be the most important piece of evidence in this case. Make sure she knows that. I walked back out through the waiting room and through the glass door and into the late afternoon light, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a full minute before I started the engine. 2 more days. Then it would be done. Ruth Hennings lived in the white farmhouse with the red metal roof a 1/4 mile down the county road from us, the same house her husband Gerald had built in 1961, and where she had lived alone since Gerald passed in 2017. I had known Ruth for 30 years. She had brought food to our door when Eleanor had her hip surgery. She had sat with Eleanor in the hospital waiting room the year I had the kidney stone that turned out to require a procedure. She and Eleanor talked on the phone. Most mornings had done so for 15 years until 3 weeks ago, when those calls had simply stopped, and Ruth had not understood why. She was standing in her front yard when I pulled in, deadheading the black-eyed Susans along her front fence the way she did every August. She straightened when she saw my truck and walked toward me with the purposeful stride of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation. Walter Hayes, she said, and the relief in her voice hit me somewhere I had not expected. Thank God, I have been worried sick. Her eyes were bright and her jaw was set, and she gripped my forearm with both hands when I got out of the truck, the way Eleanor's mother used to do when she wanted to make sure you were paying attention. "Tell me what happened to Eleanor," she said. "Because something happened to Eleanor, and that girl of yours would not let me near enough to find out what." I told her the short version enough for her to understand, not more than she needed. As I talked, Ruth's expression moved through surprise and then through anger, and then into something quieter and more resolved, the expression of a woman recalibrating her understanding of something she thought she already knew. "I came 3 times, she said when I finished. 3 times in 3 weeks, every time Victoria met me at the door with that smile of hers, and some reason why Eleanor couldn't come out. She shook her head hard like she was shaking something loose. The second time I stood on that porch long enough to hear Eleanor crying inside. I could hear her through the front window, Walter. And I went home because I didn't know what else to do, and I have felt terrible about it every single day since." "You couldn't have known," I said. "I should have pushed harder." Her voice was fierce and self-reproaching, her hands tightening on my arm. "I should have called the sheriff. I should have called you somehow. I should have—" She stopped herself, breathed. "Well, what can I do now?" "You said you have photographs," I said. "Of a car parked outside the farm." Ruth let go of my arm and pulled her phone from her apron pocket with the decisive movement of someone who had been waiting to produce exactly this. "Twice," she said, pulling up her photos. "I saw a black BMW parked at the end of your lane after dark. First time was a Tuesday, second time was a Thursday, 10 days later. I didn't know whose car it was, but I knew it had no business being there at that hour. And Gerald always told me that if something looks wrong, you document it before you try to understand it." She held the phone out to me. So I stood at my bedroom window with the lights off, and I took pictures. The photographs were clearer than I had hoped. The BMW's black paint caught the moonlight in a way that made the body of the car distinct against the dark lane. The license plate was visible in both shots, the numbers legible. And in the corner of each photograph, the timestamp and GPS coordinates had been automatically recorded by the phone's camera 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 11:02 p.m. on a Thursday, both at a location that matched the end of my farm lane precisely. "Ruth," I said, "these are going to matter a great deal." Her chin came up. "I know they are," she said simply. I asked her if she would be willing to provide a formal statement to Deputy Morrison, and she said she would do it today if Morrison would see her, and I believed her completely. I drove from Ruth's house to the Cooperstown Community Church, which sat on a rise above the east end of Main Street, with its white clapboard siding and its modest steeple that had been a landmark on the Cooperstown skyline since 1893. Pastor James Whitfield was in the small office behind the sanctuary working on something at his desk. He was 65, a tall man, run slightly to lean in. His later years with the patient and attentive manner of someone who had spent 40 years listening to people say things they found difficult to say. He stood when I came in and shook my hand and looked at my face with the directness of a man accustomed to reading what people were carrying before they told him. "Sit down, Walter," he said. "I've been thinking about you and Eleanor." I told him what I had told Ruth, the outline, the essential shape of it. He listened with his hands folded and his eyes on mine, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone organizing what they already knew against what they had just been told. "I came to the house twice," he said. "Victoria turned me away both times. The second time I called afterward to speak with Eleanor directly, and Victoria answered the house phone and told me Eleanor was resting and would call me back." He paused. "She never called back. I told myself Eleanor was going through something private and needed space, but it didn't sit right with me, and it hasn't since." "There's something else," I said. "Something you heard." He looked at me carefully. "You know about that." "I know you heard something in a parking lot," I said. "I don't know exactly what." Pastor Whitfield opened his desk drawer and took out a small spiral notebook, the kind with a green cover that cost $1.49 at the pharmacy on Main Street. He opened it to a page near the middle and turned it to face me. The entry was dated 2 weeks earlier. The handwriting was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who believed that words written down were words that could be trusted. "Parking lot, Cooperstown Market. Overheard Victoria Hayes on phone. Direct quote. The old man won't know until it's too late. Cole needs to move faster. Did not understand context. Recorded here in case relevant later. I stared at that entry for a long moment. "You wrote it down," I said. "I didn't know what it meant," he said, "but something told me it mattered." He closed the notebook and held it out to me across the desk. "Take it. If it helps Eleanor, take it." I took the notebook and held it carefully the way you hold something that turns out to be more valuable than it looked. I thought about Ruth standing at her darkened bedroom window with her phone, Tom Briggs marking an email pending because something felt off, Pastor Whitfield writing a note in a green spiral notebook because something told him it mattered, Eleanor hiding an old iPhone under her pillow and teaching herself to use the voice memo app. None of them had known about each other. None of them had coordinated. Each one had simply done the thing that felt right when something felt wrong, and together they had built something that no single person could have built alone. "Pastor," I said, "would you be willing to give a formal statement to the county sheriff's office?" He was already reaching for his jacket. "Tell me when," he said. 72 hours is not a long time, unless you are waiting inside it, in which case it is the longest unit of time the human body is capable of experiencing. I have waited out ice storms that came in fast off Lake Ontario and sat on the farm for 4 days killing everything in the low fields. I have waded through a 3-week drought in August of 2007, watching the corn curl at the edges and doing the mathematics of loss in my head every morning over coffee. I have waded through equipment failures and contract disputes and one terrible February when Eleanor's mother was dying in a hospital in Rochester, and there was nothing to do but sit beside her and wait for what was coming. None of those waits felt like this one. Wednesday passed slowly. Victoria came by in the morning as she had been doing. I was on the porch with my coffee when her Audi came up the lane, and I raised my cup at her when she got out of the car, the way I had raised it 1,000 times before, and she smiled and came up the steps and said, "Good morning," and I said good morning back, and all of it was true, and none of it was real. We sat at the kitchen table. Eleanor came down and made eggs. Victoria talked about the meeting, Friday framing it as a preliminary conversation, just to hear what Cole had to say. No pressure, no commitment. I nodded in the places a man would nod if he were considering something seriously and had not yet made up his mind. "He's going to want to meet somewhere neutral," Victoria said. "He suggested his office in Albany. Is that all right with you?" "Albany's fine," I said. Under the table, Eleanor's foot found mine and pressed down hard. I pressed back once. After Victoria left, I spent the afternoon on the tractor running the West Fields the way I did when I needed to think without being able to stop moving. The diesel engine was loud enough to fill up the inside of my head and leave no room for anything else, and after 2 hours of it, I felt steadier than I had since I'd come home. Thursday morning, Morrison called. "The warrant is signed," she said. "Both names, Victoria Hayes and Richard Cole. The FBI agent from Albany is coordinating with my office. He'll be at the meeting Friday with 2 of my deputies. We'll be in position before you arrive." She paused. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," I said. "How's Eleanor?" I looked at Eleanor through the kitchen window. She was in the garden, not the tomato rows, those were still dead. But the herb bed along the south fence crouched down, pulling weeds with the focused and deliberate energy of a woman who needed to put her hands in the dirt. "She's holding," I said. "Good," Morrison said. "See you Friday." Thursday evening, I sat with Eleanor at the kitchen table after dinner, and we went through everything one more time. The thumb drive with the camera footage, the photographs of the documents, the bank transaction summary Tom had printed, Ruth's photographs with their GPS timestamps, Pastor Whitfield's green notebook, Eleanor's iPhone with the 8 days of recordings. I divided everything into 2 sets and put each set in a separate envelope, one for Carlton, one for Morrison. I sealed both envelopes and put them in the inside pocket of the jacket I planned to wear Friday. Eleanor watched me do all of this without speaking, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. When I finished and looked up at her, she set the mug down carefully. "I want to be there," she said. "On Friday. I want to be in that room." I had thought about this. I had gone back and forth on it since Monday. "Are you sure?" I said. "She did this in my house," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely level. "She sat across from me at my kitchen table, and she lied to my face every day for 3 weeks. She took my phone and my freedom and my peace of mind, and she made me feel like I was losing my mind on top of all the rest of it." She looked at me steadily. "I want to be there when she finds out it didn't work." There was nothing I could say to that except the truth. "Then you'll be there," I said. Friday morning came the way. Important mornings always came on the farm, without ceremony, without fanfare, the sun rising over the east fields, the same way it had risen every morning for 130 years, on this property, indifferent to what the day was going to hold for the people below it. I put on the dark suit I wore to weddings and funerals. Eleanor came into the bedroom while I was working on the tie and stood behind me at the mirror and reached around and took the tie from my hands without a word and tied it herself the way she had done at every wedding and funeral for 39 years. Her fingers were steady. Her eyes in the mirror were clear and dry and resolved. "Ready?" I said. She smoothed the lapels of my jacket with both hands and stepped back and looked at me. "Let's go get our farm back," she said. We walked out to the truck together in the early morning light, and I held the passenger door for Eleanor the way I always did, and she got in and folded her hands in her lap, and I went around to the driver's side and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway and turned south toward Albany, Eleanor looked back at the farm through the passenger window. The corn was coming up green on the west side. The herb bed she had weeded yesterday was neat along the south fence. The empty tomato cages stood in their rows waiting. She looked at them for a long moment, then she faced forward and did not look back again. 72 hours of waiting, 3 weeks of damage, one manila envelope on a conference table, before I tell you how it ends for Victoria and Cole type justice below. I need to know you're still in this with me. A reminder, some elements of this story are fictional, included to illustrate a larger truth. If this content isn't right for you, you're welcome to step away right now. No hard feelings. Cole's office was on the 12th floor of a glass building on State Street in Albany, 4 blocks from the Capitol. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk and an elevator bank with brushed steel doors that reflected everything back at you, slightly distorted the way things look when they have been designed to impress rather than to be accurate. Eleanor and I rode up in the elevator without speaking, standing side by side, her hand in mine. Her hand was warm. It had been warm since Monday morning, since the breakfast tray, and the conversation that had started putting things back where they belonged, and I had noticed it every time I took her hand since then, because the contrast with that first night was something I did not think I would forget. The elevator opened onto a reception area, with a view of the Hudson River through floor-to-ceiling windows. A young woman at the desk told us Mr. Cole was expecting us, and walked us down a carpeted hallway to the conference room at the end. Victoria was already there. She was standing at the window with her back to the door, when we came in looking out at the river, and she turned when she heard us and smiled. The smile I had been watching for 3 days, wide and warm and completely certain of itself. She crossed the room and hugged me, and then hugged Eleanor, and Eleanor hugged her back, and I watched my wife do it with a steadiness that I knew had cost her considerably. Richard Cole was at the head of the conference table, jacket on. Despite the warmth of the room, a leather portfolio open in front of him. He stood when we entered and came around the table to shake my hand with the firm, measured grip of a man who had done this many times and knew how it was supposed to go. "Walter," he said, "I'm glad you came. I think you're going to find this conversation worth your time." "I expect so," I said. Carlton was already seated at the table to the left of center, his legal pad in front of him, his reading glasses on the cord around his neck. He gave me a single small nod when I sat down. Cole took his seat at the head of the table. Victoria sat to his right, her leather portfolio open in front of her, a pen in her hand. She looked relaxed. She looked like a woman 3 signatures away from the end of a plan she had been executing for 6 months. Cole began talking. He talked for 12 minutes about land values in upstate New York, about the development potential of agricultural properties within 3 hours of Manhattan, about the specific attributes of the Hayes farm that made it particularly well suited to the luxury organic hospitality model his company had pioneered. He had charts. He had comparable sales figures. He had a rendering of what the property could look like, the farmhouse renovated into a main lodge, the barn converted to an event space, the cornfields replaced with curated gardens and walking trails. He had thought about my land for a long time. When he finished, he opened his portfolio and laid the transfer documents on the table in front of me. Clean pages, precise language, the signature lines indicated with small adhesive arrows the way important documents always were. He set a pen on top of the stack. "Take your time," he said. "Read everything. I want you to feel completely comfortable." I looked at the documents. I looked at the pen. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and set a manila envelope on the table. Cole looked at the envelope. Victoria looked at the envelope. Neither of them moved. Carlton opened his laptop and plugged in the thumb drive I had handed him in the parking garage 40 minutes earlier. The wall-mounted screen at the far end of the conference room flickered on. "Before we get to signatures," I said, "I'd like to show you something." The first clip on the screen was time-stamped 7:14 a.m., the morning after I'd left for Colorado. Victoria's silver Audi in my driveway before 8 in the morning, Victoria walking toward the house with her leather portfolio under her arm. Victoria's face did not change. She was very good, but her hand, the one holding the pen, moved it slightly off-center on the table, and she did not move it back. The second clip showed her changing the lock on my front gate. The third showed her turning Ruth Hennings away at the door. The fourth showed Richard Cole's BMW parked at the end of my farm lane at 10:47 in the evening, the two of them standing together in the dark pointing at my fields. Cole's jaw tightened. He glanced at his lawyer who was seated against the wall behind him and gave him nothing back. Carlton tapped a key and the screen changed to a waveform display and audio file. He pressed play. Victoria's voice came through the laptop, speakers smooth and patient and completely recognizable. Once everything transfers, the farm is in a structure that protects it going forward, from market fluctuations, from bad seasons, from Dad making the same decisions he's been making for 30 years. "It's better this way, Mom, for both of you. He just doesn't know it yet." The conference room was very quiet. Eleanor was sitting to my left, her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she was looking at Victoria with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not anger exactly, not grief exactly, but the expression of a woman who loved someone very much and had arrived through a long and painful process at a clear-eyed understanding of exactly who that person was. Victoria opened her mouth. "Dad, I was trying to protect..." The conference room door opened. Deputy Sarah Morrison came in first in her county sheriff's department uniform with two of her deputies behind her. Behind them, in dark jackets with federal credentials visible on their belts, two FBI agents from the Albany field office. Morrison walked to the center of the room and stopped and looked at Victoria and then at Cole with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the next few minutes would go more smoothly for everyone if she moved through them at an even pace. "Victoria Hayes," she said. "Richard Cole, I have warrants for your arrest on charges of elder financial exploitations, conspiracy to commit fraud and wire fraud under federal statute 18 United States Code, section 1343. She looked at Cole. "Mr. Cole, there is an additional charge related to the Delaware LLC registration conspiracy to commit real estate fraud involving fraudulent use of another party's property address." Cole stood up very slowly the way a man stands when he is calculating whether there is anything left to calculate and concluding that there is not. His lawyer was already on his feet, already talking, but the talking had the quality of a formality rather than an argument. The motions that get made because they are supposed to be made, not because anyone in the room believed they would change anything. Victoria did not stand. She sat very still in her chair and looked at me across the table, and I looked back at her. And what passed between us in that moment was not something I have words for and may never have words for. It was 36 years of a relationship being held up to the light and examined for what it actually was, and what it actually was, and what it actually contained. And the examining was done in about 4 seconds and left, both of us changed in ways that would take much longer than 4 seconds to understand. Morrison's deputy moved to Victoria's side of the table. "Ma'am," he said gently, "please stand up." Victoria stood. She did not look at me again. They walked her and Cole out of the conference room and down the carpeted hallway, and Carlton began collecting documents from the table, and the two FBI agents spoke with him briefly and took copies of the thumb drive contents, and all of it happened with a business-like efficiency that felt strange after the weeks of wait that had preceded it. Eleanor sat beside me through all of it without moving. When the room had mostly emptied, she reached over and put her hand over mine on the table. Her hand was still warm. "It's done," she said. "It's done," I said. We sat there for another minute, the two of us in a conference room on the 12th floor of a building in Albany, with a view of the Hudson River through the windows, and the autumn light coming in thin and clear from the east. Then Eleanor pushed back her chair and stood up and straightened her jacket and picked up her purse. "Take me home, Walter," she said. "I want to see the farm." The case did not end on a Friday afternoon in a conference room in Albany. That was the day it became visible, the day it stopped being something happening in the dark and became something the law could see and name and act upon. But the work of undoing what had been done, the legal work, the financial work, the slower and more private work of putting a person back together after something like this, that work took considerably longer. Carlton filed the motion to void the power of attorney the following Monday morning. Under New York state law, a power of attorney obtained through undue influence through sustained psychological pressure that compromised the signing party's free will can be declared void by a court as if it had never existed. The recordings Eleanor had made were submitted as evidence. The judge granted the motion 9 days after it was filed. The Hayes Farm LLC, registered in Delaware, was dissolved by court order 2 weeks after the arrests. Every document associated with it, the registration, the operating agreement, the correspondence between Victoria and Cole's company, was entered into the federal case file. The money took longer. The 3 ATM withdrawals, $950 in total, were recovered through the restitution process, the court ordering Victoria to repay every dollar with interest as a condition of her sentencing. Tom Briggs had held the loan restructure request in pending status long enough that no damage had been done to the farm's operating loan, and the bank's fraud department, after reviewing the case file, formally expunged the fraudulent email from the farm's account record. The criminal case moved through the federal system over 12 months. Victoria's attorney argued, as Carlton had predicted, that Eleanor had signed the power of attorney voluntarily, that the recordings were taken out of context, that the family financial discussions had been mischaracterized as coercion. Carlton played the full 8 days of recordings in sequence in order, and let the jury hear the arc of them: the first day's warmth, the middle day's steady pressure, the final recording's unguarded admission that the farm needed to be protected from me. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Victoria was convicted on 3 counts: elder financial exploitation under New York state law, conspiracy to commit fraud, and wire fraud under federal statute. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, with a minimum of 3 years to be served before eligibility for parole. She was ordered to have no contact with Eleanor or with the farm property for the duration of her sentence, and for 3 years following her release. Richard Cole was convicted on 2 counts: conspiracy to commit fraud and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and was permanently barred from holding a real estate license in New York State. The Delaware Bar Association, notified of the conviction, initiated proceedings to revoke the operating status of his shell company network, a process that Carlton told me would likely take another year, but would eventually reach the same conclusion. I did not attend the sentencing. I was at the farm. Eleanor and I had talked about it, and we had decided together that the courtroom was not where either of us needed to be on that day. Carlton was there. Morrison was there. That was enough. Instead, on the morning of Victoria's sentencing, Eleanor and I drove to the farm supply store in Cooperstown and bought 2 flats of late-season tomato seedlings, a variety called Mortgage Lifter, which Eleanor had been wanting to try for 3 years and which I had kept meaning to order and never had. We brought them home and planted them in the south garden in the afternoon light, working side by side in the rows Eleanor had cleared of the dead plants weeks earlier. Eleanor did not talk much while we planted. Neither did I. There are kinds of work that say what words cannot, and planting is one of them. My nephew Daniel had driven down from Buffalo 2 weeks after the arrests and spent a month at the farm, sleeping in the spare room and working alongside me every day. He was 29 and strong and did not ask unnecessary questions, which was exactly what I needed. We fixed the irrigation system together, replacing the sabotaged valves on sectors 3 and 4, running new line along the east field, testing each zone until the water ran true. We renegotiated the 2 supply contracts that Victoria had canceled, and both partners came back without requiring much persuasion once I explained what had happened. Daniel left on a Saturday in late October, his truck loaded with a case of apple cider and 2 dozen eggs from Eleanor's chickens. He hugged Eleanor in the driveway for a long time before he got in the truck, and she held on to him and patted his back, the way she had patted the backs of people she loved her whole life. And I stood by and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since the moment I had turned into the farm lane and seen the dead tomato plants. Eleanor did not bounce back quickly, and I would not pretend otherwise. For the first 3 months, she did not want to be alone in the house. Not out of fear exactly. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but because the house had been a place where she was alone for too long, under the wrong circumstances, and the association needed time to change. I rearranged my schedule so that one of us was always there, and Ruth Hennings, who had taken to calling every morning, began stopping by in the afternoons as well, and slowly the house became itself again. Eleanor saw a counselor at the Otsego County Senior Center, a woman who specialized in elder financial abuse and its psychological aftermath, every week for 10 months. She told me once on a drive home from one of those sessions that the hardest part was not the fear or the exhaustion or even the betrayal. The hardest part was the period after when she had to relearn how to trust her own judgment, how to know when a situation was safe and when it wasn't, without the filter of constant suspicion that the experience had installed in her. She was working on it. She was always working on something. Ruth Hennings still called every morning. Pastor Whitfield had organized a community meeting in November, not about the case, but about elder care in the community, about what neighbors could do to look out for one another, about when it was right to push past a polite smile at the door and ask harder questions. Tom Briggs had since introduced a verification protocol at the bank. Any loan modification requests submitted electronically now required a follow-up confirmation call to a pre-registered number before processing could begin. It was a small change. It had already flagged 2 suspicious requests in the 8 months since its introduction. The farm recovered. It took 1 full season, but by the following summer, the East corn was healthy, and the supply contracts were running again, and the dairy herd was producing at the levels I expected. The apple orchard had been neglected during the worst weeks of it, but apples are patient, and they came back. Carlton sent me the final case closure letter in late September, 13 months after the arrests. I read it at the kitchen table and put it in the file folder, where I kept the important documents, and went outside to where Eleanor was working in the garden. She looked up when she heard the screen door. "It's done," I said, officially. She nodded once and went back to what she was doing. That was all either of us needed to say about it. The first real morning of spring came on a Thursday in early April, and I knew it was the first real one because Eleanor was already in the garden when I woke up. Not the careful, tentative kind of gardening she had done through the fall, moving slowly, one eye always on the driveway, her shoulders carrying something that had no name, but that I recognized and that broke my heart a little every time I saw it. That woman had been present in my house for months, and I had learned to move quietly around her grief, the way you move around a bruise, careful not to press. This was different. This was Eleanor the way Eleanor had always been. Straw hat, canvas gloves, with the worn patch on the left thumb, crouched at the south end of the tomato rows, with her full attention on what her hands were doing and nowhere else. I stood at the kitchen window for a long moment before I moved. Just stood there with my coffee going warm in my hands, watching her work the soil around the base of the nearest cage, and I felt something in my chest that I had not felt in a very long time. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than relief. The feeling of a thing being returned to its right place after a long time away. I poured a second cup and went outside. She heard the screen door and looked up. I handed her the coffee without a word, and she took it with both hands, and we stood together, looking at the rows, the way we had stood together, looking at things for 39 years, fields before, planting calves, in the first days the sky, when weather was coming, in 2 people who had learned that some things were better witnessed side by side, and in silence. The mortgage lifter seedlings she had started in the mudroom back in February were in the ground now. 8 rows of them, small and green, and staked along the south fence where they would get the best of the afternoon light. Eleanor had saved the seeds herself from the plants we had put in the previous fall, before the first hard frost took them. She had dried them on paper towels on the kitchen counter, the way her mother had taught her kept them through the winter, in a small envelope she had labeled in her careful handwriting, and stored in the drawer where she kept her garden notebook. She had not asked me for help with any of it. She had not mentioned it until the seedlings were already 2 inches tall under the grow light in the mudroom, and she showed them to me one morning, almost as an aside, the way she showed me things she was quietly proud of, and did not need me to make a fuss over. She had simply done it, the way she did most things that mattered. The apple trees along the north fence were beginning to bud, the branches losing the hard winter lines and softening toward green. The east cornfields were still bare, but the soil had been turned and had the dark, ready look of ground that knows what is coming and has made its peace with the waiting. "You were up early," I said. "The light looked right," she said. I thought about the drive back from Colorado, 400 miles of country radio and gas station coffee and a picture in my head of this woman, in this garden, in this light. I had carried that picture through Wyoming and across the state line and up into the green hills of Otsego County, and I had turned into the farm lane and found the dead tomatoes and the wrong lock on the gate, and Eleanor sitting in the wingback chair, with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on something past the window that I could not see. I thought about everything that had come between that moment and this one. Carlton with his eyes closed, listening. Tom Briggs waiting for me in the lobby with his jacket buttoned and his face carrying something he had been sitting on for 2 weeks. Ruth Hennings standing at her darkened bedroom window with her phone photographing a car she did not recognize because something told her she should. Pastor Whitfield writing a sentence in a green spiral notebook in a parking lot because something told him it mattered. Deputy Morrison and the warrant she had built carefully enough to hold up in federal court. And Eleanor herself, alone in this house for 21 days, frightened and exhausted and cut off from everyone who might have helped her, teaching herself in the dark to use a voice memo application on a phone with a cracked screen because some deep and unshakable part of her knew she was going to need it. No luck anywhere in that story, only what people chose to do when something felt wrong, only what they decided mattered enough to act on. I had been trying to find the right words for a long time. Months, really, trying to find the sentence that was equal to what Eleanor had done alone in this house, the sentence that could hold the weight of 21 days, and an old iPhone, and 8 recordings, and all the things she had not said to me, because she had been told I could not hear them without it killing me. I had not found it. I had come to think that it probably did not exist, and that Eleanor would be the first to tell me so, if I tried to offer her one. But I wanted to try. You know what I thought about? I said, the whole drive back from Colorado. Eleanor looked at her tomato rose, her coffee cup held in both hands, steam rising in the cool April air. What? This I said? You, right here, exactly like this. She looked at me then, over the rim of her cup, with the particular look she had given me across 39 years of mornings. The look that said she knew me well enough to know when I meant something all the way down, and that she was receiving it in that spirit, and that no further elaboration was required or desired. I knew you'd come home, she said. I always will, I said. She nodded slowly and looked back at the garden. I know, she said. Even on the hard days, I knew. She set her cup on the fence post and pulled her gloves back on, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has said what needed saying and is ready to get back to work. I found the trowel leaning against the south fence post and knelt in the row beside her. We worked through the morning without talking much, the way two people work when they have spent enough years doing it together that the work itself becomes the conversation. Who moves, where, who reaches for what, when to stop and when to keep going. The light came up slow and pale across the fields. A pair of red-winged blackbirds argued over something at the edge of the east field and then went quiet. The tomato seedlings stood in their rows, small and improbable and full of intention, the way all new things look before you have learned to trust them. At some point, Eleanor straightened and looked out over the farm, the way she sometimes did, the barn, the orchard, the fields, the house, taking the full measure of it, the way you take the measure of something you were afraid of losing and did not lose. It's still ours, she said. It's still ours, I said. She pulled a small weed from the base of the nearest cage and dropped it in the bucket between us without ceremony. Good, she said, and went back to work. The light was thin and April pale across the new corn ground. The tomato seedlings stood in their rows, small and hopeful. The apple trees along the fence were greening at the tips. My wife was beside me, her hands in the soil, her hat tilted against the morning sun, and we were home. I have turned this family story over in my mind more times than I can count. What I know now is simple. The most dangerous betrayal does not come from strangers. It comes from someone you loved enough to trust completely. This kind of family betrayal does not arrive loud or obvious. It arrives gentle, patient, and smiling with paperwork and a reason to sign today. I was not a perfect husband. I stayed away too long. I told myself no news was good news when I should have pushed harder. Do not make my mistake. If someone you love is suddenly unreachable, if their phone is always managed by someone else, if neighbors are being turned away at the door, trust that feeling in your gut. Show up. Call the landline. Notice if the garden has gone to seed. I believe God placed enough brave, decent people around Eleanor to bring her home to me. Ruth at her dark window, Tom at his desk, Pastor writing in his notebook, Eleanor herself hiding a phone under her pillow. That was not coincidence. That was grace. This family story is ours. I hope it never becomes yours. But if any part of it felt familiar, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for educational purposes. If this content is not right for you, we respect that. Completely feel free to choose what serves you best.